The most dangerous moment in a marriage is not when love disappears, but when respect quietly dies. On the 42nd floor of the Whitmore penthouse overlooking the silver lights of Manhattan, Naomi Carter stood in front of a floor-length mirror and smoothed her hands over the soft silk of the nightdress her husband once said was his favorite. The fabric was simple, ivory-colored, elegant without trying too hard, the kind of thing Alexander Whitmore used to say made her look like peace after a long day. Tonight the city outside stretched for miles beneath the glass walls, taxis threading through midnight traffic like ribbons of gold, the Hudson reflecting the distant glow of streetlights. But Naomi barely noticed the view anymore. 5 years ago she would have stood there with a glass of wine, laughing at Alexander's stories about impossible boardroom negotiations and billion-dollar deals, believing their life together was the kind people wrote about in magazines. Back then their marriage had been described as unlikely but beautiful. The brilliant black law student from Brooklyn and the quiet, calculating tech billionaire whose company had transformed half the financial infrastructure of the country. Naomi remembered the first night Alexander brought her to this penthouse. He had opened the door with the shy pride of a man who had built everything himself, gesturing to the endless skyline and saying, "All of this feels empty if you're not here." At the time she believed him completely. Tonight the apartment felt enormous and silent, the air carrying that faint polished scent of marble floors and expensive wood that had long ago replaced the warmth of real conversation. Naomi glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:18 p.m. Alexander was late again. Lately late had become the only predictable thing about him. Meetings that stretched past midnight. Trips he forgot to mention until he was already at the airport. Messages that were answered hours later with polite, professional brevity instead of the playful warmth he once reserved only for her. Naomi had told herself not to assume the worst. Billionaires carried heavy schedules. Empires didn't run themselves. But something deeper had shifted in the quiet spaces between them, something colder than distance. Tonight she had decided to try one last time to remind him of who they used to be. That was why she wore the nightdress. Not because it was dramatic or seductive, but because it belonged to a memory Alexander had once cherished. A memory of laughter and quiet mornings and the kind of love that felt safe enough to breathe in. Naomi turned slightly toward the window and watched a helicopter blink red lights across the dark sky as it moved over the river. The reflection staring back at her in the glass looked calm, almost regal, the posture of a woman who had learned long ago that dignity could survive even when hope was fragile. She adjusted the thin strap of the dress and exhaled slowly. Tonight she would ask Alexander one simple question. Was their marriage still real, or had it become just another contract inside his empire? The elevator doors down the hall chimed softly. Naomi felt her heartbeat tighten, not with excitement, but with a strange clarity that had been growing inside her all evening. Footsteps crossed the marble floor outside the living room. The front door opened with the quiet electronic click of the security lock. Alexander Whitmore stepped inside the penthouse, his charcoal coat draped over one shoulder, his expression tired and distant in the soft light of the entryway. For a moment, he didn't notice Naomi, standing near the window. He set his phone down on the console table and loosened the collar of his shirt like a man who had spent too many hours negotiating with people who measured life in numbers. When he finally looked up, his gray eyes stopped on Naomi. The silence stretched between them. Naomi waited. Somewhere deep inside her, something steady and unbreakable had already begun to form, though Alexander had no idea that the quiet woman standing in his favorite nightdress was about to make the most important decision of her life. Alexander Whitmore studied Naomi Carter in silence for several long seconds, as if he had walked into a room that did not belong to him anymore. The soft lighting of the penthouse reflected off the glass walls and turned the city outside into a field of quiet stars. But his expression did not change. Naomi noticed it immediately. In the early years of their marriage, Alexander had always looked at her with warmth first and calculation second. Tonight the order had reversed. He stepped farther into the living room, setting his coat carefully across the back of a leather chair before loosening the cuffs of his shirt. The movements were precise, controlled, the habits of a man who spent his life managing billion-dollar decisions without hesitation. Naomi did not move from the window. The silk of the ivory nightdress caught the soft glow from the ceiling lights. and for a moment, she saw a flicker of recognition pass through his gray eyes. Years ago, that look would have been followed by a quiet smile and a playful comment about how she always managed to look more elegant than the women he met at the most expensive galas in the city. Tonight there was only a pause. Alexander walked to the bar near the center of the room and poured himself a glass of water instead of the bourbon he usually chose after midnight meetings. He drank slowly, then set the glass down with deliberate calm. Naomi watched him the way a lawyer studies a witness, quietly collecting details that reveal the truth long before the questions begin. Finally he spoke. His voice carried the polished restraint of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. "Naomi, we need to talk." The words were simple, but they carried the tone of a boardroom announcement rather than a husband speaking to his wife. Naomi folded her arms gently across her waist, not in defense, but in patience. "I was hoping we would," she said softly. Alexander glanced at the clock on the wall as though measuring how long this moment might cost him. Then he stepped closer until the distance between them was only a few feet, close enough that Naomi could see the faint shadows of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "The company is entering a complicated quarter," he said. "There are negotiations happening that require absolute stability." Naomi tilted her head slightly. Stability. The word felt strangely clinical inside a marriage. Alexander continued before she could respond. "Investors are watching every move I make. The board is concerned about personal distractions that could affect the company." Naomi remained still, the calm expression on her face almost serene. "And our marriage is one of those distractions." It was not a question. Alexander exhaled quietly. "Something like that." The city lights shifted across the glass walls as a line of taxis moved along the avenue below. Naomi thought of the countless nights they once spent standing in this exact place, watching the traffic together while talking about dreams that felt limitless. Tonight those memories felt distant, like photographs from someone else's life. Alexander reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a thin envelope. The paper was crisp and perfectly aligned, the kind lawyers prepared with clinical efficiency. He placed it on the marble table between them. Naomi did not need to open it to understand what it contained. His voice remained calm as he spoke again. "I believe it would be best for both of us if we agreed to separate quietly. No media attention. No complications. The legal arrangements have already been prepared." Naomi let the silence stretch long enough for the weight of his words to settle into the room. Somewhere deep in the building, an elevator door opened and closed, the sound echoing faintly through the hallway. She looked down at the envelope for a moment, then back at Alexander. "You came home tonight to ask for a divorce." Alexander did not correct her. He simply nodded once, the gesture efficient and final. Naomi felt something inside her become unexpectedly clear, like fog lifting from a landscape she had been trying to understand for months. She took a slow breath, her voice steady and quiet. "And if I do not sign it?" Alexander hesitated only briefly before answering. "It would make things very difficult for everyone involved." Naomi studied his face carefully, recognizing the careful language of a man accustomed to winning negotiations without raising his voice. "Difficult," she repeated softly. That was the word he chose instead of threat. Naomi straightened slightly, the reflection of Manhattan's endless lights shimmering behind her like a silent witness. For the first time that evening, Alexander Whitmore realized that the calm woman standing before him was not afraid of the future he was trying to place in front of her. Alexander Whitmore did not raise his voice, but the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted with the quiet gravity of his words. Difficult meant more than inconvenience. Naomi understood the language of powerful men well enough to recognize the careful edges hidden inside that single word. She walked slowly toward the marble table and picked up the envelope. The paper felt light in her hands, almost delicate, yet it carried the weight of 5 years of marriage reduced to legal paragraphs and signatures waiting to happen. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she turned the envelope over once, studying the clean, precise handwriting of the law firm printed in the corner. Alexander watched her with the calm patience of a man accustomed to outcomes that always leaned in his favor. Naomi placed the envelope back on the table exactly where it had been. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued its quiet rhythm outside the glass walls. A distant siren moved through the avenues, fading slowly into the night. Finally, Naomi looked up at him. Her voice remained soft, but unmistakably steady. When did you decide our marriage became a liability? Alexander shifted his weight slightly, as if the question required a calculation he had hoped to avoid. It is not personal, Naomi. Naomi gave a small, thoughtful nod. That answer sounded exactly like him. Everything in Alexander Whitmore's world eventually became strategic. She walked a few steps across the living room, letting her fingers rest lightly against the back of a chair. The penthouse around them still looked exactly the same as it had the day they moved in together. The Italian marble floors, the tall bookshelves filled with volumes Alexander rarely had time to read anymore, the quiet glow of Manhattan stretching endlessly beyond the windows. Yet tonight it felt like a museum dedicated to a version of their life that no longer existed. Naomi spoke again, her tone calm but precise. You prepared legal documents before you spoke to me. That means this conversation did not start tonight. Alexander did not deny it. He folded his hands loosely in front of him. I wanted to avoid unnecessary emotion. Naomi allowed herself a small, almost invisible smile. Emotion. That word sounded foreign coming from him. For a long moment, she simply studied his face, memorizing the quiet distance in his expression. She realized something unexpected in that moment. She was no longer searching for the man she married. That man had slowly disappeared long before tonight. Naomi walked back to the table and tapped the envelope gently with her fingertips. You said things would become difficult if I refused to sign. Alexander inhaled slowly. The board does not respond well to public complications. Naomi understood immediately. Investors, media speculation, financial headlines linking Alexander Whitmore's name to a high-profile divorce. Reputation was the currency that powered men like him. She tilted her head slightly. So this is about protecting your empire. Alexander did not respond right away, which was answer enough. Naomi felt a strange calm settle deeper inside her chest. The fear she once expected to feel never arrived. Instead, there was only clarity. She remembered the night years ago when Alexander proposed to her in a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. He had taken her hands across the table and said that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. Tonight that promise felt like a story told by strangers. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his. What happens if I say no? Alexander's voice remained measured, but there was a new firmness beneath it. The lawyers will proceed regardless. It will become public eventually. Naomi heard the finality in that sentence. This was not a discussion. It was a decision he believed had already been completed. She looked down at the envelope once more, then back at him. The silence between them stretched longer than before. Finally, Naomi exhaled slowly and straightened her posture. The elegant composure that had once impressed every courtroom she ever stepped into returning with quiet authority. You spent months preparing for this moment, Alexander. He said nothing. Naomi nodded slightly, as though confirming a detail in a case she had already solved. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet strength that filled the vast living room. The one thing you did not prepare for is that I might not be afraid of losing this life. Alexander Whitmore did not immediately respond to Naomi's quiet declaration. The words settled into the air between them with a calm certainty that felt more powerful than anger ever could. He had expected hesitation, perhaps tears, perhaps negotiation. What he had not expected was the composed woman standing before him, as if the life he was offering to remove from her had already lost its power. For the first time that evening, Alexander studied Naomi more carefully. The ivory silk of her nightdress moved softly as she shifted her weight, but it was not the elegance of the fabric that held his attention. It was the calm in her eyes. Naomi Carter had once been known among her law professors as someone who never raised her voice in debate, yet somehow dismantled arguments with quiet precision. Alexander remembered that trait very well. It was one of the reasons he fell in love with her. Now he realized he had not seen that version of her in years. He crossed his arms slowly, his voice measured but slightly sharper than before. You are not understanding the situation clearly. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Then explain it to me. Alexander gestured toward the envelope on the table. The documents outline a respectful settlement. You will retain significant financial security. The properties in Brooklyn remain in your name. The investment accounts we established for you will not be touched. Naomi listened without interrupting, the faint glow of Manhattan's skyline reflecting across the glass behind her. Alexander continued speaking with the same calm tone he used during high-level negotiations. The media will receive a joint statement. There will be no public accusations, no legal disputes, and no damage to your reputation. It is the most dignified solution available. Naomi let a few seconds pass before responding. The most dignified solution for whom? Alexander paused. That question was not written into his prepared script. Naomi walked slowly across the room until she stood beside the tall window again. Below them, thousands of lights filled the city like a restless constellation stretching across miles of concrete and steel. 5 years ago she had looked at this view and felt proud that she and Alexander had built a life high above the noise of the world. Tonight the height no longer impressed her. She spoke quietly while still facing the glass. Do you remember the night we moved here? Alexander remained silent. Naomi continued anyway. You said the city looked different from up here. You said success felt strange because the view meant nothing unless someone was standing beside you. She turned back toward him slowly. I believed you. Alexander's expression did not change, but Naomi noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. For a moment, she wondered whether some distant part of him remembered that night as clearly as she did. Then the familiar composure returned to his face. People change, Naomi. Circumstances change. Naomi gave a thoughtful nod. That was true. Circumstances had changed. She walked back to the table and picked up the envelope again, this time opening it carefully. Several neatly printed pages slid out. She scanned the first few lines without surprise. Legal language designed to make endings appear orderly. She placed the papers back inside and set the envelope. Down once more. Your lawyers did excellent work, she said calmly. Alexander exhaled slowly. Then you understand why this is the best course of action. Naomi looked directly at him. No, I understand why it is the most convenient course of action. The quiet correction landed heavier than any accusation. Alexander shifted his stance slightly, his patience thinning for the first time that evening. You are being emotional. Naomi almost laughed, though the sound never left her lips. Emotional. That word again. The irony was almost elegant. She folded her arms gently and held his gaze with steady clarity. Alexander, you prepared contracts, lawyers, and public statements. You arranged every detail of how this marriage should end. But there is something you forgot to calculate. Alexander waited. Naomi spoke with calm certainty. You assumed that I would protect your empire the same way I protected this marriage. The room fell silent again. Outside the glass walls the city continued moving, unaware that inside the Whitmore penthouse the balance of power had quietly shifted. For the first time since he walked through the door, Alexander Whitmore realized that the conversation was no longer unfolding according to his plan. Alexander Whitmore remained still for several seconds after Naomi finished speaking, as if the quiet certainty in her voice had interrupted a calculation he could not immediately resolve. In boardrooms across the country, he was known for controlling conversations with surgical precision, guiding every negotiation toward the outcome he wanted before the other side even understood the game being played. Yet tonight something about Naomi's calm refusal had changed the atmosphere of the room. The penthouse no longer felt like the center of his empire. It felt like neutral ground. Alexander walked slowly toward the window, stopping a few feet away from Naomi. From this height, the streets below looked distant and orderly, the traffic moving through Manhattan like thin threads of light weaving across a dark canvas. He folded his hands behind his back, his posture returning to the composed authority that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the technology sector. Naomi, he said carefully, I am trying to resolve this situation in a way that protects both of us. Naomi watched him without interrupting. Alexander continued, his voice calm but edged with quiet firmness. If this process becomes public, reporters will ask questions. They will look for reasons. They will create stories whether they are true or not. Naomi understood exactly what he meant. The world loved powerful men until their private lives became headlines. Then the same world enjoyed watching those men struggle to control the narrative. She turned slightly so that the lights of the city reflected across the glass beside her. The media has always liked stories about powerful marriages, she said softly. Alexander nodded once. Which is why it is better to end this quietly. Naomi studied his expression. There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty, only calculation. That realization felt strangely heavier than any accusation could have been. She walked slowly back toward the marble table and rested her fingers lightly on its smooth surface. You spent months planning how to remove me from your life without damaging your reputation. Alexander did not deny it. Naomi continued, her tone calm and thoughtful. You built companies from nothing, Alexander. You predicted markets before they existed. Yet you made one mistake tonight. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. Naomi lifted the envelope again and held it up between them. You assumed I would be negotiating for comfort. The silence stretched across the room. Outside, a gust of wind moved along the side of the building, rattling the distant hum of the city far below. Alexander finally spoke again. What exactly are you saying? Naomi placed the envelope back on the table and looked directly at him. I am saying that I am not interested in protecting your empire anymore. For the first time since the conversation began, Alexander's expression shifted with something close to surprise. Naomi saw it immediately. That small reaction confirmed what she had already begun to understand. He believed control belonged entirely to him. Naomi continued speaking, her voice steady and composed. For 5 years I defended you in rooms where people questioned your decisions. I stood beside you when journalists criticized your company. I protected your privacy because I believed our marriage was worth protecting. Alexander said nothing. Naomi took a slow breath and felt a quiet clarity settle inside her chest. But a marriage cannot be protected by one person alone. Alexander's gaze hardened slightly. Be careful, Naomi. The warning came softly, but the meaning was unmistakable. Naomi recognized the tone. It was the same tone executives heard when negotiations moved into dangerous territory. She met his eyes calmly. Are you threatening me? Alexander did not answer right away. The pause itself was answer enough. Naomi felt the final piece of uncertainty inside her disappear. The woman who had once waited nervously for his approval was gone. In her place stood someone who had finally recognized the difference between partnership and control. She straightened her posture and spoke with quiet certainty. Alexander, you walked into this room believing you were offering me an ending. What you did not realize is that tonight you also gave me something else. Alexander waited, his expression guarded. Naomi's voice remained calm as she finished the sentence. You gave me a reason to stop protecting the man you have become. Alexander Whitmore held Naomi's gaze without speaking, yet the quiet confidence he usually carried had begun to fracture in subtle ways that only someone who knew him deeply could recognize. Naomi saw it in the slight tightening of his shoulders, in the careful way he inhaled before answering, in the silence he allowed to stretch longer than necessary. For years Alexander had built a reputation as a man who never allowed conversations to slip beyond his control. Investors admired that quality. Competitors feared it. But Naomi understood something the financial world never saw. Control was easiest when people around him believed they had something to lose. Tonight that assumption no longer applied. Alexander finally moved away from the window and walked slowly toward the marble table. His footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor, the sound carrying through the quiet apartment like a clock measuring the final moments of something that had once been permanent. Naomi watched him calmly. Alexander rested one hand on the table and looked down at the envelope that contained the documents he had prepared so carefully. For a moment he seemed to consider the papers as if they belonged to someone else's decision. Then he spoke again, his voice lower than before, but still measured. Naomi, this does not need to become a conflict. Naomi did not respond immediately. She had heard that tone before. It was the tone Alexander used when negotiations began to move outside his expectations, and he wanted to bring them back into familiar territory. After a few seconds, she answered quietly. It became a conflict the moment you decided our marriage could be dissolved like a business contract. Alexander exhaled slowly. You are making this more dramatic than it needs to be. Naomi allowed herself a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. Dramatic. That word felt almost ironic standing 40 stories above Manhattan with divorce papers between them. She walked toward the living room bookshelf and gently traced her fingers along the spines of several old law textbooks she had brought with her when they first moved into the penthouse. Alexander had insisted she keep them there, saying he liked the reminder that the apartment belonged to two ambitious people instead of one. Naomi turned one of the books slightly, straightening it on the shelf. I studied contract law for years, Alexander, she said calmly. One of the first principles we learn is that agreements fail when one party believes they hold all the power. Alexander watched her carefully. Naomi turned back toward him. Tonight you believe the power belongs to you because you control the money, the lawyers, and the narrative the media will eventually hear. Alexander did not deny it. Naomi stepped closer again, her posture relaxed but steady. But there is something else you forgot. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. Naomi spoke with quiet clarity. The truth does not belong to the person with the most resources. It belongs to the person willing to speak it. For the first time since he entered the penthouse, Alexander looked genuinely unsettled by her words. The reaction lasted only a moment before his usual composure returned, but Naomi noticed it immediately. He straightened slightly, his tone firm again. You would not damage both of our reputations out of pride. Naomi shook her head gently. Pride has nothing to do with this. She gestured lightly toward the envelope on the table. Those papers represent the version of this story you want the world to believe. Alexander crossed his arms. It is the cleanest version. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. Clean stories are often the least honest ones. The city outside continued moving without pause. Somewhere below, a train rattled across elevated tracks, the faint vibration barely reaching the high floors of the building. Naomi stepped closer to the window again and looked down at the endless grid of streets. 5 years ago she had stood in this exact place believing she and Alexander were building something lasting together. Tonight she realized that the future she once imagined had quietly disappeared long before the conversation began. She turned back toward him one final time. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. You asked me to sign away our marriage as if it were a minor adjustment to your life. Alexander remained silent. Naomi met his eyes with steady certainty. The truth is much simpler than that. She paused briefly before finishing the sentence. I am not afraid of leaving this apartment, Alexander. I am only surprised that it took me this long to see I should have left sooner. Alexander Whitmore stood motionless after Naomi finished speaking, and for the first time since the conversation began, the silence between them carried something unfamiliar to him. It was not anger. It was not negotiation. It was the unmistakable sound of control slipping away. Naomi watched the realization pass across his face with quiet clarity. For years she had seen that expression directed at competitors in boardrooms, at executives who underestimated him, at journalists who believed they had uncovered something damaging about his company. It was the look of a man recalculating the balance of power. But tonight the equation was different. Naomi walked slowly across the living room, her bare feet silent against the marble floor. The penthouse still glowed with the calm luxury that had once made her feel safe, yet now it felt strangely distant, as if she were already a visitor in a place that no longer belonged to her. She stopped near the grand staircase that led to the upper level and rested her hand lightly on the polished railing. 5 years earlier she had run up those stairs laughing while Alexander chased her, both of them younger and certain that their future would only grow stronger with time. Tonight that memory felt like something she had borrowed from another life. Alexander finally broke the silence. His voice remained controlled, but the edges of patience had begun to thin. You are speaking as if everything we built together means nothing to you. Naomi turned back toward him slowly. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried the steady clarity of someone who had finally reached the end of a long internal argument. What we built together meant everything to me, she said softly. That is why I stayed long after I began to see what it had become. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. Naomi continued before he could interrupt. There were nights when you came home after midnight and did not even notice I was still awake waiting for you. There were months when every conversation we had sounded like a briefing instead of a marriage. She gestured quietly toward the envelope on the table. And tonight you arrived with lawyers instead of honesty. Alexander looked away briefly toward the city lights, as if the view might offer a perspective he could not find in the room. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of betrayal or cruelty. Instead, she spoke with the calm precision that once made judges listen closely whenever she stood in a courtroom. You told me earlier that circumstances change. I agree. People change as well. Alexander turned back toward her. The distance between them now felt greater than the width of the entire apartment. Naomi took a slow breath and folded her arms gently across her waist. When we first met, you were ambitious, but you were also kind. You believed success was something worth sharing. Somewhere along the way you stopped believing that. Alexander's expression hardened again. Success requires difficult choices. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. That is true. But difficult choices reveal who we really are. The city outside continued to move through the night without noticing the quiet collapse unfolding high above it. Naomi walked back toward the table one final time and placed her hand beside the envelope. The paper no longer felt heavy. In fact, it felt almost irrelevant. Alexander watched her carefully, waiting for a reaction he could still control. Naomi looked at him calmly. You wanted me to sign these documents tonight because you believed the conversation would end here. Alexander said nothing. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady and clear. But the truth is that our marriage ended long before you printed those pages. She paused briefly, allowing the words to settle between them. The only difference is that tonight I finally decided to stop pretending it had not already happened. Alexander Whitmore listened without interrupting, but the calm authority that once defined every movement he made had begun to fade into something more uncertain. The quiet certainty in Naomi's voice had changed the atmosphere of the room in a way he had not anticipated. For years, he had managed billion-dollar negotiations by predicting how the other side would react. Investors, competitors, regulators, they all behaved within patterns. He understood. Naomi no longer followed any pattern he recognized. He moved slowly toward the center of the living room, placing both hands on the back of the leather chair, as if grounding himself in the familiar space of the penthouse. The city lights behind Naomi shimmered across the glass wall, turning her silhouette into a calm, unshakable figure against the vast skyline. You are speaking as though the past 5 years were meaningless, Alexander said quietly. Naomi shook her head once, gently. No, I am speaking as someone who finally understands what those years were worth. Alexander straightened and studied her face carefully. Naomi Carter had always been composed, but tonight her calm carried a different quality. It was not the patience of someone hoping things would improve. It was the clarity of someone who had already decided they would not. Naomi stepped away from the table and walked slowly across the room, letting her fingertips glide briefly along the smooth edge of the piano that sat near the window. Alexander had bought the instrument during their second year of marriage because she once mentioned she used to play when she was younger. The piano had rarely been touched since. Naomi paused beside it and looked down at the polished surface reflecting the lights of the apartment. Do you remember why you bought this? She asked quietly. Alexander followed her gaze to the piano. You said you missed playing. Naomi nodded slightly. And you told me that success meant having room in your life for the things that bring peace. Alexander did not answer. Naomi continued speaking with the same calm tone she had used all evening. At the time I thought you understood something important. That life could not be measured only in numbers or headlines. She looked back toward him slowly. But somewhere along the way the only thing that mattered to you was control. Alexander crossed his arms again, the familiar defensive posture returning. Control is necessary when everything around you depends on your decisions. Naomi accepted that without argument. Perhaps, but marriages do not survive on control. They survive on respect. The word lingered in the air like a quiet truth that had been waiting years to be spoken aloud. Alexander turned away briefly, staring out at the endless network of streets far below. Naomi could see the tension in his shoulders now, a subtle rigidity that suggested the conversation had moved far outside his expectations. After a moment he spoke again, his voice firm but less certain than before. You are acting as if I betrayed you. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked back toward the marble table and rested one hand beside the envelope again. The papers inside it remained perfectly aligned, untouched by the emotional weight they represented. She looked at Alexander calmly. Betrayal does not always happen through dramatic events. Sometimes it happens quietly, one decision at a time, until the person standing beside you no longer recognizes the life you built together. Alexander held her gaze, searching perhaps for anger or bitterness that he could challenge. Naomi offered neither. Her voice remained gentle when she spoke again. The moment you decided to solve our marriage with lawyers instead of honesty was the moment you stopped treating me like your partner. The city outside continued its restless motion, unaware that inside the Whitmore penthouse the foundation of a once celebrated marriage had finally collapsed. Naomi lifted the envelope one last time and placed it back exactly where Alexander had set it earlier. The movement was calm, deliberate, and final. Then she looked at him with steady clarity. You believe tonight would be the moment you ended our marriage. She paused briefly before finishing the thought. The truth is that tonight is simply the moment I finally accepted it. Alexander Whitmore did not move for several seconds after Naomi finished speaking. The penthouse felt unusually quiet now, as if the entire city beyond the glass walls had stepped back to watch what would happen next. Naomi could see the familiar calculations moving behind his gray eyes. For most of his adult life, Alexander had lived in a world where every conflict could eventually be resolved through leverage, negotiation, or time. Yet the calm certainty in Naomi's voice had introduced something he rarely faced. Finality. He walked slowly toward the marble table again, his fingers resting briefly against the edge as though the cool surface might steady his thoughts. The envelope containing the legal documents remained exactly where Naomi had placed it. For the first time since he brought it into the room, Alexander did not look at it with confidence. Instead, he looked at Naomi. When he spoke again, his voice carried less authority than before, though the effort to maintain control was still visible in every word. You are making a permanent decision based on emotion. Naomi remained still beside the window, the city lights reflecting softly across the glass behind her. For a moment, she simply watched him, studying the man she had once believed she understood completely. Then she shook her head gently. This is the first decision tonight that has nothing to do with emotion. Alexander frowned slightly. Naomi walked slowly toward the center of the living room again, her steps quiet across the marble floor. 5 years earlier, she had imagined spending decades inside this apartment, building a life with the man who once promised her that success meant nothing without love. Now the penthouse felt less like a home and more like a carefully constructed stage where a long performance had finally ended. She stopped a few feet away from him. You said earlier that circumstances change. That is true, but there is something else that changes when people live long enough inside a quiet disappointment. Alexander's expression hardened again. Naomi continued speaking with calm precision. Eventually you stop asking whether things will improve and start asking why you are still pretending they will. Alexander crossed his arms, the familiar defensive posture returning as though it were instinct. And your solution is simply to walk away. Naomi looked directly into his eyes. My solution is to stop negotiating with someone who already decided I was no longer part of his future. The words were not loud, yet they carried a quiet strength that filled the entire room. Outside, a helicopter moved slowly across the sky above the Hudson River, its distant lights drifting across the glass wall like a reminder of how small the penthouse truly was compared to the vast world beyond it. Alexander turned away briefly, pacing a few steps across the living room before stopping near the piano. His reflection stared back at him from the polished black surface. Naomi watched the movement calmly. For years she had seen him stand in that exact spot, while speaking confidently on late-night calls with executives in different time zones, managing decisions that affected thousands of employees. Tonight he seemed less certain about the one conversation he had assumed would be simple. After a moment, he turned back toward her. You are forgetting something important. Naomi waited. Alexander's voice regained some of its earlier firmness. The life you are leaving behind is not ordinary. Everything here was built for both of us. Naomi allowed herself a small, thoughtful nod. That part was true. This apartment, the quiet luxury, the view stretching across Manhattan, it had once symbolized the extraordinary life they believed they were building together. But symbols only mattered when the meaning behind them remained real. Naomi walked toward the window once more and looked down at the endless pattern of streets far below. Thousands of people moved through the city at that very moment, each carrying their own quiet stories, their own choices about what kind of life they were willing to accept. She turned back toward Alexander slowly. The life you were talking about stopped belonging to both of us a long time ago. Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi continued before he could interrupt. You believe tonight would force me to choose between comfort and uncertainty. She paused briefly, letting the silence settle between them. The truth is that the real choice happened long before you came home with those papers. Naomi's voice remained calm as she finished the thought. Tonight is simply the moment I finally stopped choosing you. Alexander Whitmore stood near the piano for a long moment after Naomi's words settled into the silence of the penthouse. The room felt different now, as though the gravity that had always kept their lives in a predictable orbit had quietly disappeared. For the first time since he had walked through the door that evening, Alexander no longer looked like a man who controlled every outcome. He looked like someone realizing that the future he had planned did not include the certainty he once assumed. Naomi watched him calmly from across the living room. She felt none of the anger she once imagined might fill this moment. Instead, there was only clarity, the kind that arrives slowly after years of unanswered questions finally resolve themselves. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan continued to glow with restless energy. Thousands of lights flickered across buildings and avenues, a living constellation that never stopped moving no matter what happened inside a single apartment high above the streets. Alexander finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "So this is it." Naomi did not answer immediately. She took a slow breath and let her gaze drift across the familiar space around them. The marble floors, the tall windows, the shelves of books that had once symbolized shared ambition. For years she had believed this place represented a life they built together. Tonight it looked more like a monument to something that had already ended long ago. When she spoke, her voice remained calm and steady. "This is simply the moment we both stopped pretending." Alexander looked at her carefully, as though searching for hesitation that might still change the outcome. "You would really walk away from everything we built?" Naomi met his eyes without hesitation. "Everything we built only works when both people are still building it together." Alexander ran a hand slowly through his hair, a gesture Naomi had seen countless times during difficult negotiations. But this conversation did not follow the rules of any negotiation he had mastered. For years he had solved problems by offering solutions that made logical sense. Tonight logic had lost its influence. Naomi walked slowly toward the table again. The envelope remained untouched where Alexander had placed it earlier in the evening. She looked down at it for a moment before gently sliding it a few inches back toward him. The movement was quiet, almost symbolic. "You should keep these," she said softly. Alexander frowned slightly. "You are not even going to read the rest of the terms." Naomi shook her head. "I already understand the only part that matters." Alexander waited. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his once more. "You decided that your life would be easier without me in it." The words were not spoken with bitterness. They were spoken with acceptance. Alexander exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture revealing that the calm certainty he once carried was no longer as steady as it used to be. Naomi continued speaking before he could respond. "For a long time, I believed that love meant waiting for someone to remember why they chose you in the first place." She glanced briefly toward the window, where the endless movement of the city reflected across the glass. "Tonight, I realized something different." Alexander remained silent. Naomi finished the thought with quiet conviction. "Love is not something that should require constant negotiation to survive." The room grew still again. The distant hum of the city felt softer now, as though the world beyond the penthouse had moved farther away. Naomi took one final look around the apartment, allowing herself a brief moment to remember the version of life she once believed would last forever. Then she looked back at Alexander Whitmore. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was no uncertainty left in it. "You believed tonight would be the moment you ended our marriage." She paused briefly before finishing the sentence. "The truth is that tonight is simply the moment I finally chose my own future instead of waiting for you to decide it for me." Alexander Whitmore remained standing beside the marble table long after Naomi finished speaking, the envelope resting between them like a quiet symbol of everything that had changed during the past hour. The room felt larger now, almost unfamiliar, as though the penthouse itself had shifted the moment Naomi decided she was no longer waiting for his approval. For years Alexander had believed certainty was his greatest advantage. In the world of billion-dollar negotiations, hesitation was weakness and confidence often determined the outcome long before contracts were signed. Yet standing there across from Naomi Carter, he realized something unexpected. Certainty belonged to her now. Naomi watched him carefully, but there was no triumph in her expression, only calm acceptance. She had imagined this conversation many times over the past year, though never exactly like this. In those earlier thoughts she had expected anger, accusations, perhaps even a desperate attempt to explain why everything had slowly fallen apart. Instead, the moment had unfolded with a quiet honesty that left very little left to say. Alexander finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, almost reflective. You believe walking away will make things simpler. Naomi shook her head gently. I never said simpler. She glanced briefly toward the endless skyline outside the glass walls before returning her gaze to him. I said it would finally be honest. Alexander studied her face carefully. For the first time since he had known her, Naomi looked completely certain of herself in a way that did not depend on anyone else's agreement. That realization unsettled him more than any argument could have. He walked slowly toward the window and stood beside it, looking down at the city that had become the center of his empire. From this height, Manhattan looked orderly, almost calm, its complex problems reduced to neat lines of light and movement. But Alexander knew better than anyone how fragile control could be once a single element moved beyond expectation. Naomi spoke again quietly behind him. You spent years building companies that could survive any crisis. Alexander turned slightly, listening. Naomi continued. Markets collapse. Investors panic. Technologies change overnight. The only way those companies survived was because you learned how to adapt. Alexander nodded once, acknowledging the truth in her words. Naomi folded her arms lightly across her waist. Then consider tonight another kind of adaptation. Alexander gave a faint, almost humorless smile. You are comparing our marriage to a business restructuring. Naomi did not react to the remark. No, I am comparing it to something much simpler. Alexander waited. Naomi met his eyes with steady clarity. The moment when someone realizes they can no longer keep pretending the structure still works. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Outside the penthouse, a faint wind brushed against the building's glass exterior, carrying the distant noise of traffic far below. Naomi stepped toward the staircase leading to the upper level of the apartment. She paused halfway across the room and looked back once more. For a brief moment her expression softened with the memory of who they once were before ambition and distance quietly replaced the connection they had shared. I did love you, Alexander, she said gently. Alexander did not doubt that. In fact, the certainty in her voice made the statement more real than any emotional outburst could have. Naomi continued with calm honesty. But loving someone cannot mean abandoning yourself while you wait for them to remember how to love you back. Alexander lowered his gaze briefly, the words settling deeper than he expected. Naomi turned slightly toward the staircase again. The night had grown late, and the conversation that began with a simple envelope had quietly reached its natural conclusion. She looked back at him one final time before taking another step. Her voice remained calm, steady, and certain. The future you plan tonight does not include me, Alexander. She paused just long enough for the truth of the moment to settle completely. And for the first time in a long while, that finally feels like the right direction. Naomi paused halfway up the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the smooth wooden railing that curved toward the second level of the penthouse. From there she could see the entire living room below, the quiet glow of the city behind Alexander Whitmore, the marble table between them, and the envelope that had begun the conversation hours earlier. It felt strange how something so thin and ordinary could carry the weight of an entire marriage ending. Alexander remained near the window, his posture still but no longer rigid. For the first time that night, he did not look like the man who dominated financial headlines and controlled billion-dollar negotiations with a calm certainty that rarely failed him. Instead, he looked like someone standing in the quiet aftermath of a decision he had believed would unfold very differently. Naomi studied him for a moment, not with anger, but with a kind of distant understanding that had taken years to arrive. She had spent so much time hoping the man she married would return that she had not noticed when he slowly became someone else. Now the realization felt almost peaceful. Alexander finally spoke again, his voice softer than before, as if the conversation had gradually moved beyond the place where arguments mattered. I never wanted this to end with bitterness. Naomi nodded gently. Neither did I. She walked slowly down the final step she had climbed and returned to the living room floor, not because she had changed her mind, but because there were a few truths that still deserved to be spoken face to face. The city beyond the windows shimmered quietly behind them, endless towers and avenues stretching toward the dark horizon like a reminder that the world continued moving long after personal stories reached their turning points. Naomi crossed the room and stopped a few feet from Alexander. Her voice remained calm, steady, almost reflective. When we first met, you told me something I never forgot. Alexander looked at her, waiting. You said the reason you built your company was because you believed people deserve technology that made their lives simpler and more connected. Naomi smiled faintly at the memory. Back then I thought that belief extended to your personal life as well. Alexander lowered his gaze briefly, the weight of the past settling between them like a quiet echo of the people they used to be. Naomi continued gently. I do not think you changed because you stopped believing in connection. I think you simply started believing success required sacrificing it. Alexander did not argue with her. The silence itself felt like confirmation. Naomi looked once more around the apartment, allowing herself to absorb the final details of a life that had once felt permanent. The piano reflecting soft light near the window. The bookshelves filled with the ambitions of their younger selves. The endless Manhattan skyline that had once looked like the beginning of everything. She took a slow breath. For years I thought staying here meant loyalty. I thought patience would eventually bring us back to where we started. Alexander watched her closely, as if trying to understand the moment that had quietly transformed her into someone who no longer waited for his choices to define her future. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his again. But loyalty cannot exist when one person is the only one holding it together. The words were not harsh. They were simply honest. The penthouse remained silent except for the distant hum of the city far below. Naomi turned slightly toward the hallway that led to the elevator. Her voice carried the same calm certainty that had guided every word she spoke that evening. I do not regret the years we shared, Alexander. They taught me who I was when I believed in us. She paused briefly, her hand resting lightly against the wall near the entrance. And tonight reminded me who I am when I finally believe in myself instead. Naomi stood near the entrance of the penthouse for a quiet moment, her hand resting lightly against the wall beside the elevator panel. The hallway lights cast a soft glow across the marble floor, and from where she stood, she could still see Alexander Whitmore across the living room near the tall glass windows that overlooked Manhattan. The city outside continued to shimmer with restless life. Endless headlights moving along avenues, distant bridges glowing against the dark river, and towers rising into the night like silent witnesses to the countless private decisions unfolding behind their windows. For years Naomi had believed the height of this apartment meant something powerful. It had once symbolized success, security, and a future she thought was built on two people moving forward together. Tonight the view looked different. From this distance the city did not appear glamorous or intimidating. It appeared vast, open, and full of possibilities she had forgotten existed beyond the boundaries of this penthouse. Alexander remained where he was, his silhouette framed by the glass wall and the endless grid of lights behind him. He had not tried to stop her. Perhaps he understood that nothing he said now would change what had already become clear. The envelope containing the legal documents still rested on the marble table between them, untouched since Naomi had slid it back toward him earlier. The papers that once represented his certainty now looked strangely small against the enormous quiet of the room. Naomi turned once more to face him fully. Her expression was calm, the same steady composure that had carried her through every word she spoke that evening. For a brief moment neither of them said anything. The silence felt less like tension and more like the closing chapter of something that had simply reached its natural ending. Finally Naomi spoke, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the living room. I hope you find the life you are looking for, Alexander. Alexander looked at her with an expression that was no longer defensive or calculating. It was thoughtful, almost distant, as if he too was beginning to understand the quiet truth that had unfolded during the night. Naomi continued gently. I truly do. Because for a long time I believed we were searching for it together. Alexander lowered his gaze briefly, the faintest shadow of regret passing through his expression before he looked back up. Naomi gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment without trying to prolong it. Some stories do not end with anger or dramatic final words. Sometimes they simply reach the point where both people finally see the truth clearly enough to stop holding on. Naomi turned toward the elevator panel and pressed the button. A soft mechanical sound echoed from the hallway as the elevator began its slow ascent toward the penthouse level. She glanced once more across the apartment, allowing herself a final look at the life she had once believed would last forever. The piano by the window. The books that still held the ambitions of their younger selves. The quiet luxury that had once seemed like the reward for everything they had built together. Then she looked back at Alexander Whitmore one last time. Her voice remained calm, almost peaceful. The best thing we can do for each other now is move forward honestly. Alexander did not argue. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, the soft interior light spilling into the hallway beside Naomi. She stepped inside and turned briefly before the doors closed. For the first time that night, she allowed herself a faint smile, not of victory, but of quiet freedom. Then the doors slid shut, and the elevator carried Naomi Carter down through the silent tower toward the vast city waiting below, while far above the lights of Manhattan continued to shine against the dark sky, reminding anyone who cared to look that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to begin again.